Good afternoon, everybody. And welcome to, I hope everything with the technology here works. And it would be great if I just could ask somebody in the chat to maybe just briefly introduce themselves and just let me know with a thumbs up if everything with both, if you see the slide and sound is all right. It would be great if I just could have a thumbs up. All good. Everything's all right. Great. Perfect. Then let's get started. And thank you for seeing so many people here. I'm really excited about that. And obviously always a little bit nervous to see if I can fill you in on the first episode here about social belonging and Greg Walton's work. And yeah, my name is Gordon Erickson. I am a representative of this project called BelongVET. It's co-funded by the European Union, and essentially we are 5 European partners, actually 6, and then we have an associate partner from the US that is supporting the project from South Carolina. And the project is all about social belonging in VET. Yeah, and I work in a software company called Student Pulse, and we are surveying experts, and we work in well-being and are using some of our technology in this project. But that's not kind of the core for today. I'm just going to go straight into it to get you started for the first. And outside of that, you can ask questions, but I think we're in a very limited time. But please post questions in. I will potentially address them up for the next webinar. That is Thursday next week at the 16th. And also, if you click on the handouts, you'll be able to download the slides that I'm presenting today. So feel free. And this webinar is also recorded. So any colleagues you have that might be interested, feel free to share that with them. But let's get started. So we are at the first episode today, and that is the why behind social belonging in a vocational and education training context. And I'm going to be very specific on kind of the science or what inspired us with Greg Walton's work on social belonging and try to give you a pretty specific insights on what is it really, and why is it important, and what is it? Even though it's called the why, I'm going to talk about what is social belonging and the why behind. And then the second episode that will be next week, we're going to talk more specifically about how do you actually do it? So what are the ins and outs of doing what is called a VICE intervention, actually working with students and providing the VICE intervention or the intervention with students. I'm going to address that next week. And on the third episode, we are going to show you participating here in this webinar how it is to be a student. So that's essentially you being a student and experiencing a social belonging intervention process, essentially. So somebody from one of the partners will be assisting me on this webinar at that point to go through the actual so you'll have a first-hand experience of what it is and how it works. Good. And when you're done with those, and also if you have the opportunity to share or invite some of your colleagues, they can definitely sign up for the second episode and the third one. All will be recorded. But when you have finalized participating or reviewing the content and the materials, you'll be there will be an opportunity to request a certificate for you to put on your LinkedIn profile, or just have a proof of understanding VICE interventions and Greg Walton's work and how to apply it in vocational training in Europe. Great. So let's get started with what it is. So I think I'm going to take you back a few years. I was attending an American-Danish well-being conference here in the northern part of Denmark. And to that conference, there was a Stanford professor called Greg Walton who was invited to this specific conference to talk about social belonging and some of the research he's been doing. And feel free after the webinar to request any research, or use the chat or whatever to find his research. It's excellent. He's also last year released a book called The Ordinary Magic, which is essentially about social psychology and how to change people's perception or your perception about adversaries or hardships or setbacks, and what small things can do to change, into big results. So that's all what Professor Greg Walton's research is about. And there's a few things that really inspired me when I heard him at the conference, and some of us as a part of the core project group, we learned about his research and thought this is really applicable in European context. First of all, Greg Walton is a social psychologist, so he's very much focused on psychology essentially, and how we experience things and what lens we look through when we experience different things. And Greg Walton's work was very much focused on, students from minority backgrounds, they interpret or see things or setbacks or adversaries of things they experience as proof of they don't belong. And also he figured out that perception can be changed. So it's a perception essentially. So the core idea here is you are from a minority background, you see things that are ordinary, but your perception is, or you see them through the lens that is proof that I don't belong, but that can be changed. And what is the actual model that he developed is called a VICE intervention. So I might be using that, but essentially it's the intervention that we're using as a part of this project. But how it works is that it's a brief targeted exercise, and it takes less than an hour, and that can reframe that specific experience. So they have a perception, and through a very efficient and quick exercise, that can reframe and transform the student experience. And that was really, and we will go much more in depth with that on the next episode on how do you do it? So today I'm gonna briefly explain what that means, but essentially it's a very efficient way of changing perception about setbacks and adversaries that somebody experiences. And then he has done numerous studies that just shows that if you change the internal shifts about perception or, the proof that I don't belong, that can have significant effect on long-term academic results and life outcomes for those students that experience the actual intervention. So it's quite dramatic how these pretty simple or efficient intervention actually change the outlooks of these students. That's kind of the core idea. So this could be, and I'll try so essentially there is like two things, right? You can change. So when we're talking about inclusion and diversity, there's essentially two places you can change. You can change the environment around people. You can make it more welcoming, and you can change the toilets that we use, and the way that we see it, and accessibility, and all kinds of things. But the other place to start is the perception of what's going on. And through social psychology, we might have a specific students, as with this girl, that experiences this situation through her lens because of her minority, that the reason that nobody's talking to her and she feels lonely is because of a specific identity or her minority. That might be the experience. That's the lens she's looking through. And I'm going to call this the trap. So essentially, nobody want to sit next to the students. And the trap here is that he might think, the reason for that is I'm different. I might have a different skin color, or, but that's the proof that I don't belong. Nobody want to talk to me because of that. And that turns natural moments, essentially something that all of us experiences, into a proof that I don't belong here. And the VICE intervention that Greg Walton developed here is the actual intervention, or the intervention here. And the intervention consists essentially of two things or three things. One is that all students that are starting at some kind of institution or education, they are asked if they would want to help future students. So there's no stigma here. There's no selecting you because you are, consist of a specific identity. No, it's all about selecting some students and say, hey, do you want to help future students? The second part is that through the intervention, we will ask these students to read other stories from other students that were experiencing some of the same adversaries or setbacks as these students did. And then the last part is the student will actually write a story to pass on to future students. That is the intervention. And by reading through, which is the core driver, reading through other students that has experienced the same as you and are a little bit similar to you, and they actually were successful, it was all normal, it was not, it's not you because of the proof that you think of, it's completely normal. That changes the perception. And it's important here that it changes, it's a shift. It's not the environment. So there might still not be somebody sitting next to this guy on Monday, but he or she will see it differently because the intervention changed and they're not looking for proof that they don't belong. They will have a different perspective. Essentially, this is the core of a VICE intervention in social belonging, that students seek proof that they don't belong because of a minority or a specific identity. They will read through other students who had the same feeling or the same adversaries, and it will change the perspective for that specific student. It takes less than an hour, and it's dramatic what changes over time. So just to recap, essentially, the intervention here, it takes around 50 minutes to do this exercise for students. And it can be done online, it could be done in a classroom. We'll get back to that in the next episode, but essentially it's going to take around 50 minutes to do this. And some of the research that Greg Walton has been showing over and over again is that persistent or dropout students that will get a college degree improves quite significant from 76% to 86% first-year students. So a reduction in dropout because of this intervention. Also, grades on a pretty broad scale, grade averages will increase. And he even done longer studies where they took some of the same students and reviewed after 3 and I also think maybe 7 and 8 years, and see that effects last, and it also have long-term effects on students. So just from a simple psychological exercise to change the perception of me looking for proof that I don't belong, changes quite dramatic what students experience over time. And his research is solid, so I highly recommend to do that. Also, we spoke with Madsen from a Danish counseling society, might be the right word, a Danish guy who took this into higher education into Denmark and tried to do and see similar results. But we wanted to take this into vocational training context. So the core idea of social belonging is really when I see things go wrong, I wonder, is this because who I am? And that's what we want to change. That's the psychological dynamics of students that we want to change. When they see an obstacle, we want them to have a different frame, lens, perspective on why am I experiencing this. And I was very inspired by this and thought, okay, let's see if we can take this into European context of vocational students and take this great research and make it work. So the project is all about that. So how did we take it, and where are we now taking this social belonging intervention into the European Union and to the European context? And why did we essentially want to do that? First of all, I think there is some pretty untapped potential. So we are doing a lot and lots in European context on inclusion and diversity and changing all of that. And I didn't see anybody trying to address inclusion and diversity from a social psychology perspective. Does it mean we shouldn't change the environment? No, definitely. There is lots of room for improvement, but I think it might be a very relevant effort or project to try to change the social psychology dynamics of students while we simultaneously try to change the environments around them. And also in Europe, there is huge number of movement through different cities, and we have immigrants moving all over, and we are highly depending on the future workforce in vocational training. So it's making sure that inclusion and diversity and students are successful and feels a belonging is absolutely instrumental to the future workforce here. Yeah, I think I already covered that. Maybe one of the things that, after reviewing his research, there was definitely something about cultural adaptation that was required. So the US has data on students that we will never capture or keep in Europe. So that was one of the key problems that we faced in this project. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. But that is some of the core things that needed to be adapted to European context. Just one thing on the European context then. So because before we even started the project here, I've been working long in retention and student well-being on VET students. And just to tell you that social belonging and social relationships on VET students, they attribute that is the most significant driver for student well-being and retention. So social well-being or social belonging is the most important driver for student well-being. That is the most important driver for retention or low dropout. And at the last score, you look there, if you see the 32-3. On a research made, there's a 10x times risk of students dropping out if they are low on student well-being as opposed to high well-being and satisfaction and attending school. So addressing the social environment in VET schools is the most important to drive retention. And social belonging is not the only thing that will drive that, but that can be a significant attribution to keeping students engaged with their social peers. And it's a quite efficient 1-hour intervention that addresses students from minority backgrounds, will change some of these. So just to say that in a European context, dropout in VET school is still a significant problem. So we put together a pretty diverse team of different partners. So essentially Tradium, Rock Norderport, Ruth from Norway, Reiko from Estonia, and CMA Pays de l'Olar from France are our VET partners. The Dutch one, Rock Norderport, we actually had and have participation from Esmeralda, who has been, core of the design on how we actually produce and do the actual intervention with her background, working as lead for inclusion and diversity across this huge institution. And I am representing Student Pulse as more of the technology and research-backed institution to support the scale out, and also just I was very inspired by this, so I'm kind of the lead inspirator, I would call it. And then we have an associate partner, York Technical College from South Carolina, sorry, who will, based on what we do in Europe, try to reflect that back to Greg's research from the US and see, are you applying it correctly? But they're also going to help us see if the things that we changes to VET environment actually applies for technical college environment in the US. So they are participating as an associate partner. So where are we now with the project, and what went on, and what are we actually doing? So first, one of the things that is kind of a little bit tricky with it, I'm gonna see if I can explain that. I had, to do this picture to really. So when we're talking about identity and minority, every student might feel that they belong to different identities that they will attribute to that they experience setbacks and adversaries. So it could be, hey, my mom can't afford the school trip. That's the reason that nobody want to talk to me, or that I'm not doing as well as the others, or my skin color could be another one, my weight. So all of these internal attributes is something that will be an issue when it comes to social belonging. They will look for proof that that is the reason that they don't belong. And when we're looking about Greg Walton's work, it's important that you have the opportunity to make a more targeted intervention. So essentially, when you're doing the intervention, you would want to read other students of color that had successful and experienced that these adversaries was not related to that. So you want to make the intervention as specific to the identity as you can. And that is one of the key issues that we experience coming from the US, because when you sign up to a college or university or college in the US, through the registration process, any American students will essentially tell most of these information, maybe not wait, but you will tell, about your parents, you will potentially apply for scholarships because of your financial situation, you will let them know if you're, sexuality, so all these attributes will be noted. And that makes it very easy to recruit students in the US that might benefit from a specific intervention. Whereas in the European Union, particularly for vocational training and education and training, we do not register that. Under privacy concerns, that is not how we want to be in the European Union. So we had to take a different approach. So first off, we tried to identify what are the two most significant identity groups that we want to target through this project. And we chose these two. We chose, what is called BAME, so that is essentially Black, Asian, minority, ethnic. That is any student from any ethnic minority background. That could be people that are, immigrants or any kinds of identifying themselves as that. And then the other part would be socioeconomic status. So students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. And the reason that we chose those two as a part of the project design is if we look at as a European level for social inclusion and diversity and making sure that we thrive in the European Union, those are two significant things that just through our networking and partnering through European countries is significant. So we want to target those who are broad, and all partners across the European partners would find these within their students. We even did a pretty significant study across all to find, is there others? And there were like 15 others identity groups that would be worth addressing. But we chose these two to be the primary ones that we wanted to target with the VICE intervention. The problem with this is that how do we select these students without essentially telling them that they need an intervention? We could even make things worse if we went to the classroom and said, hey, because of your lower socioeconomic status, we want to, have you participate in something. That was not an applicable possible way to address that. So we went on and talked to Jesper Madsen from Student Counseling, who had been doing this for higher education in Denmark, and figured out that most students starting in a new institution they share most of the same identity. I'm new here in this field, I'm new here on this institution, which means if I experience setbacks and adversary, that's because I'm new. So we decided on this specific project that we wanted, instead of just addressing the two above, the BAME and SES students, we wanted to address all new students starting, but then specifically have stories and interventions that address those two more specific identity groups. And we also, as a part of the process, essentially had two ideas for the intervention, and we will go into depth with that next time. But there's something about what I call full class intervention. That's essentially all students starting, where we tell them, hey, as a part of your onboarding, you'll need to be able to help future students. Would you want to participate in that? And then they'll read over some stories and be a part of the intervention. And the second one would be a more technical trigger, where we ask them some questions. And then based on if they don't feel they belong, we will offer them to, on their own, do the social belonging intervention on their own. And that is applicable for all students, not just new students starting at the specific. So the European discovery here is that it's very, very hard to identify students out of these identity groups, because it's more of like an internal, I might feel that I identify myself with one of these. And what we figured out is that most students starting in a new institution might benefit from a social belonging intervention, and maybe read some of the stories that are relevant to that. So where are we now? We are about 18 months into the project. It's a 2-year project. We have done more than 1,000 student surveys across the 5 countries in the beginning to really understand what are the different identity groups. Is it relevant to do that? And we did a lot of localization and tried to make the actual model for intervention ready, available for the 5 different languages. And then we have been pilot testing with 50 students across the 5 different countries to ensure that we had kind of firsthand experience on how it is to recruit the students, how do the actual intervention material look like, how do they share the stories to have feet on the ground and experience firsthand. And what is happening right now is that all partners is scaling the implementation. So we are essentially taking hundreds of students through the actual VICE intervention material. We will do a lot of evaluation and analysis, and then we will have the playbook, the online website for you guys to be able to go out and do the actual intervention in your own environments out there. So that's what's gonna happen. So what did we work so far? Identification works. We're going to talk about that next work broadly. We will not be able to identify into very specific, but essentially we know that all students will benefit from having a social belonging intervention. It will only make them more successful. Context matters. Even though we have translated this from European to US to European context, it's very important that if you use it in other countries, it needs very specific contextual translation. And we'll talk about the different environments that we worked in also, because some vet students are obviously not good with writing and reading. So how did we come about that? But context matters here. And then educators need tools. So it's important that it's easy applicable. We'll go through that next time. And then right now we are just scaling it and trying it out and see how it works across the partners. So that's where we are right now. So I think right now I might want to just invite you to go to, if you look at the intervention playbook down here, the second one, you will essentially be able to go to belong.vet and see the process from a student perspective. And there's also a teacher guide there, so you can see how it looks from a teacher perspective and a student perspective. So both the student materials and the intervention playbook is somewhat available right now for scaling. And we will be delivering on the identification toolkit and the white paper later this year. But as a part of this 3-segment webinar, I'm going to go into a little bit more of the nitty-gritty details on how to apply it and what are the things that you should be aware of. But I would just say, if you want to go a little bit deeper now and haven't, just to try it out from a student perspective, definitely go there and pick a language and go through it. And what will happen next time? That's Thursday next week, same time too. And I did hint that maybe Greg Walton would be a part of this due to time zones, and he's on, what would that be? That would be the West Coast of the US. Time zones is a little bit tricky with Greg Walton to have him here. I've met him a few times, but I decided I wanted to go through this on my own speed talk here for the first time. But make sure that to share this information with any colleague you might have, any questions, research that you want, feel free, download the handout and share the information, and then just go. I will make sure that you get invitations next time for the next episode of this webinar. So thank you a lot for being here. I hope it made sense and you are as inspired as we are. We will see you next week. See you.